Welcome to Tresor Expansions. I'm Chloe Lula, the host of the show and a Tresor Club resident. With these interviews, we want to shed light on the artists closely affiliated with Tresor, longtime legends who have released on the label across the decades, past and present regulars in the booth, and up-and-comers who are just getting their foot in the door of the club. In each conversation, I have the subject reflect on their musical influences and the songs that shaped them, as well as their connection to the sound and ethos of the Berlin institution. This month's episode is with the Detroit artist Rod Modell, perhaps better known by his monikers Deepchord and Echospace. Modell's music is wonderfully ambient and dub-inflected, evoking the nostalgia of some of his contemporaries like Basic Channel and Biosphere. He's been moving in a faster direction as of late, which is marked by his most recent release on Tresor, the LP Captagon, which came out in 2023. Modell and I talked on the heels of a Tresor Club show that he played in Berlin a few months ago, and our conversation went in quite a few interesting directions. We discussed the psychic power of the infinite loop in living in Detroit's Eastern Market, also known as Techno Boulevard, where the Belleville Three lived, Warhol's aesthetic influence on his music, as well as minimalists like Steve Reich and Philip Glass, whose compositions are hard to immediately discern as acoustic, electronic, or some combination thereof. Modell has long lived on a lake outside of Detroit, and his life is very peaceful, made up of creative moments, doing photography, which he studied formally in school, and making music from his home studio. His approach to life and art comes across in how he communicates. He's calm, thoughtful, and brimming with observations about musical trends and what they say about the cultural zeitgeist. He and I have a shared love of industrial music. We both come from the avant-garde music concrete adjacent scene before we got into techno, so I really relished this conversation and talking about our shared musical interests. Thank you so much for listening. Here is Rod Modell. Thank you so much for joining me here in Berlin.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Chloe. I'm happy to be here.
So you're in town because you're going to be playing tomorrow night, right?
Mm-hmm.
At Archaeota.
Yeah, tomorrow's show is like it's an ambient set. I've resumed doing them, but with the understanding that it'll be promoted as such. So there won't be any surprises when people show up, and it's just drones and field recordings for 2 hours.
Oh, it sounds amazing.
So, I like that kind of stuff. That's really how all even my beat-oriented stuff starts out, is I think I put more emphasis on the background and the textures and get some ambience that I enjoy, and I incorporate some rhythmic elements, but start out with the other,
Well, on that note, you had a record that recently came out on Tresor. I guess it's been a couple of months. It came out in early June.
It's been a couple of years now.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No. It's been a little while. But that is probably my fastest and my hardest material. But it's funny. I find myself working more in that direction these days.
I think not just you. That seems to be happening a bit across the electronic music world. I think so, at least as a DJ. It seems like people are playing really hard and really fast. And there's a trend in that direction.
120, 125 beats per minute seems like slow motion to me now. I think most of the Echo Space stuff we did was like 125, 127. And I remember some of the guys in Detroit saying 133 was the magic number.
Well, I mean, speaking of the Detroit-Berlin connection,
yeah,
I had asked you to choose a track from Tresor, from the back catalog, and you chose Rave New World from X101 by Jeff Mills and Robert Hood, which was the first record that Tresor ever put out, I think, in 1993.
Yeah.
And over email, you told me that the record was hugely inspirational for you, hugely in all caps, because it transported you out of the industrial world that you were in initially. So can you just talk a little bit more about that song and where you were in your musical development when this came out?
Well, at that time, I was more into like industrial sounds. Techno kind of seemed a little bit watered down. And then that X101 album came out and it was just aggressive. It was very aggressive and it was very hard, you know, and it had like a industrial kind of a vibe to it. Jeff Mills was like fresh off of what was the Final Cut? I think that he was doing the Final Cut, and that was an industrial act.
I loved the Final Cut.
You know, and then he took and I have that on vinyl and CD, and then he took kind of the best elements of that and put it on into that X101 project. That was like half industrial and half Detroit techno, maybe. You know, I don't know. It was just very. It's just very driving, you know. I bought that album when it first came out, you know. And I was really surprised, too, because it was, Innerfish Records was the first thing that Dimitri did, and it was a lot of industrial music, and he was licensing from labels like Wax Trax and things like that. I have, like, a lot of Innerfish Records at the time. I saw this one come out, and I thought, Tresor Records, a division of Innerfish Records. That was like, it wasn't really even like officially like a label yet at that point. It was just like we started a sub-label. You know, and I thought I was kind of interested because it was a division of a label that I really liked as well, you know, and I bought it and I couldn't believe what, you know, just the aggression and I saw them. It was Jeff Mills and Rob Hood and Mike Banks. They played a concert of that material at the State Theater in Detroit around that time, and I happened to be there. And I was just like, wow, man, this is like the next level. Grew up in Detroit, and I know that for a while you were close to, was it the Eastern Block?
Eastern Market, where Jeff and Kevin and
Derek
were all based.
They had lofts in that area.
So what was that like? And
I was in the 80s. I was like an art school student. I got out of high school and went to art school for fine arts photography and was living down there. It was really an exciting time. You know, it was the first time I remember something really notable like happening with music around me in Detroit. I mean, there was rock and roll, I suppose, or Motown or whatever, but that was before my time, really. And since then, I don't know, maybe a hip hop scene or something, but it was exciting for this kind of creative energy to be coming out of Detroit, and it was actually something I liked. I felt like we were at the ground level of something.
In past interviews, you mentioned that you frequently listened to the electrifying Mojo when you were a child, and that the way he mixed records and loops opened your mind to the power of repetitive music.
Yeah, I remember one night, like I was in high school, and this one show he did, he was just mixing. It's like he had like 2 copies of the same record, and he was just mixing this one song for like an hour. I mean, that was just amazing. Like I thought, I've always been about the loop aesthetic, and song structure always kind of bored me, really, to be honest with you. I learned how to listen to music by listening to Brian Eno, maybe, or some of the ambient stuff where, you're listening to subtle changes to occur over time, as opposed to like a 4-minute song with a chorus and a break. That just always put me to sleep. That was, it should have been the other way around, I suppose. But the interest, the sound art stuff, the loopy stuff was just like, wow, man.
I mean, that's pretty innovative for radio DJing at that time.
Especially that, that was like late 80s.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned to you earlier too about Andy Warhol. And like, I kind of like almost look at this as almost like a sonic version of what he was doing.
Yeah, so like recycling. Almost.
Yeah.
Or sculpting
and looping
in a way
and,
as well. You also work a lot with field recordings.
Yeah.
Right? I think that I read somewhere that you like to capture moments that you feel are significant.
I think, if you incorporate field recordings, I think it lends a weird kind of atmosphere to the track. And I mean, a lot of times they're processed and you can't really even definitively identify them as field recordings. It could be just some weird sound in the background or something. But, I remember one time I was playing at Tresor, it was a few times ago, and, I had field recordings of frogs during the whole set. And I mean, and they were processed with like various effects. Back at that time, I used to travel with a lot of hardware effects units, I had this in the background, but like everything was kind of rhythmically affected, gated and sidechained so that it kind of was with the music, believe it or not. So, I had like 90 minutes of frogs going with kick drums and bass lines at Tresor. And I remember afterwards saying something to someone about it, about the frogs, and they just thought it was a joke. But it really wasn't a joke. It was completely serious, And I mean, it's just another instrument, I just like working with chunks of sound, and see where it goes.
Well, I can hear the field recordings in Captagon. There are a lot of voices. Like it's almost like there's this ambient whispering or like a conversation that you're overhearing in each one of the tracks.
But that adds a lot of mystery.
Yeah. It adds like almost like a hint of a narrative.
Yeah.
Do any of the recordings that you use hold some special significance when you choose them? Or are you really just listening for of course, how they sound?
No, they do have some. I don't know if it's like I'm looking for a specific thing when I'm choosing them. I think it's more like there's a specific vibe or something that I get from the field recording that makes me want to use it. I mean, there's got to be that something in there that's kind of adds like an ethereal element to the music.
When I asked you to send some more songs, the Clock DVA was called Sound Mirror.
Yeah.
So it came out on Wax Tracks, and it really reminded me of like Music to Play in the Dark from Coil, which came out a few years later, which is, I also wouldn't necessarily classify it as like industrial or really as ambient, but it kind of sits somewhere in this. Like,
Clock DVA was so great.
Yeah.
I saw him at a Tonal Festival a few years ago.
Oh, wow.
That was really good. I think that was recorded in Berlin. And they're from England, and I think they moved over here. I think Wax Tracks was in U.S. and Interfish was in Berlin here. And I think they were like cross-licensing things.
Okay.
That was a really dark album, but it was just so unusual and so unique and really sample-based, which I really like too.
I was actually surprised when you sent this over to me because your music in my mind is always just so lush and like meditative that I don't think I'd ever considered that maybe you came from like a more industrial background.
Yeah, I did.
But I love that record also. Yeah.
The whole album is really good.
So at what point did you start kind of moving away from that aesthetic and experimenting with more of the sound that you're doing now? And like your sound is Deepchord. And I know that Deepchord is a reference actually to like the sound that you try to achieve in your productions.
Well, Deepchord started out as a label. Mike Schomer and I started the label. And at that time, it was just a record label. It wasn't really an artist name. And Deepchord was a term that I used for years to describe a certain sound in a song. You know, it's like a chord hit, basically. I can remember for years thinking like, you know, here comes the hats and here comes the kick drums and the bass line and the Deepchord. You know, and that was a sound that I just personally termed to describe basically a chord hit. I suggested to Mike, well, why don't we use that Deepchord? I don't think he liked it that much, to be honest, but he eventually said, okay. I wasn't sure. We ran the label just for a couple of years, maybe 2.5 years. And, you know, Mike went on to do some other things. And then the Echo Space stuff started coming out. Modern Love was insistent on using Deepchord in the name. And I really was. Steve and I were both opposed to that, to be honest. I mean, it was a different band. But, you know, I think Deepchord had some following at the time. And I think Modern Love wanted to capitalize on that, maybe. They says, you know, well, we want to call it Deepchord Presents Echo Space. And I guess in hindsight, it was a good thing because it became an artist name, basically. So maybe like having it as like Deepchord Presents Echo Space kind of kept the name out there and kept it alive, you know. Steve kind of didn't want to travel anymore and didn't want to, you know, participate at the level he was. And I said, well, I'm going to use that label name that I came up with years ago and use it as an artist name. You know, we put out records under different names because I think we wanted to look bigger than we were, maybe. Of course, the idea was like different artists would sound different, would have different like characteristics to the music, you know, but I think at the end that's hard to do. You can tell, you know, artists that do that. You know, Frontline Assembly's got a million aliases and they all sound like Frontline Assembly, I guess, you know. So, I mean, I don't know, for example. So, I don't know.
So you referred to Basic Channel as an important reference for you. And I've always thought of your music as being in, you know, the same kind of dub techno school. And you sent me the song Dub Quadrant.
Oh, yeah.
And you said it's one of the most remarkable records of all time.
I think so.
What was it about this record that captured inspiration so much and influenced your approach to production?
Yeah, those guys did the loop thing better than anybody. You know, like just what I was talking about earlier, like just having a loop going and going and going. Nobody's done it like them. I remember the first time I heard a Basic Channel record. I went into Record Time, a record store we had in Detroit. At this time, Basic Channel only had 3 records out. It was before the Rhythm and Sound and all of the other stuff that they did, you know. I went into the dance room. Brendan from Ectomorph, BMG, he was actually working there at the time. And he was playing this record, you know. And I went up to him and I said, you know, what is this? This is crazy. Like, you know, I was standing here for like 8 minutes listening to this same loop. And he was like, man, it's Basic Channel. He said, they have 2 other records out too. They were pretty new at the time. They had 3 12 inches out. And I said, I got to get these. I said, I want a copy of all 3 of them, you know. And that was how I discovered Basic Channel, you know, was Brendan sold me these records that day. Man, I just could not stop listening to these records. I mean, morning, noon, and night, they were fantastic, you know. And there's no question that they influenced me. You know, people say, well, you know, so it's Basic Channel ripoff. It's not really a Basic Channel ripoff.
That's not what I was trying to suggest.
No, and I know that, but I've seen this a lot because there's a lot of other like influences in this music too. Like I said, like 90s ambient, a little bit more of the Detroit sound. I mean, depending on the track, yeah, there's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And, you know, as musicians, we kind of take our influences and use that as a starting off point to, you know, evolve into our own sound, you know. But those guys were fantastic. They went places nobody has gone, probably never will go. And they just did it with such a finesse.
I said I wasn't going to get techie, but I am curious what your process is like in the studio, and even maybe just thinking about how you're going to perform tomorrow. I mean, how are you putting this together?
Okay. My live sets are basically about 30 to 40 tracks of audio. I can combine elements on the fly. I just have like blobs of audio, various rhythm tracks, various synth tracks, and a lot of live effect processing. It's funny, like live in relationship to electronic music, because I think of live as like really like playing. I used to play bass guitar in bands for years, and that was more live. I mean, this is like music that's created in step time. But yet you're supposed to go to a festival or a venue and like jump around like you were a rock and roll band. I don't understand all that, really, to be honest. I think live electronic music is very different than live other kinds of music. Mm-hmm. And I've done a lot of shows with hardware. I don't really know if it makes it better.
Well, so tomorrow's going to be, it's like an immersive ambient show.
Tomorrow. Yeah.
And in terms of just the psychoacoustics, I guess. I mean, what is the appeal to you of playing in this kind of environment? And I ask because I was interviewing Drew McDowell actually a few years ago, and he told me that he knows he's succeeded in his production process when he's able to enter into a fugue state, basically, and put himself into a kind of trance. And I'm curious if you have like a similar kind of relationship to your...
Well, you want to kind of create like a altered state of consciousness, I guess, a gradient for like changing levels of consciousness. This kind of music requires a little bit of patience too, which is the biggest obstacle. I think a lot of times when you're playing drones and field recordings, people have a hard time just like sitting there and chilling out too. But I do find that people that come to these sort of things know what they're getting into. And they're the people that do enjoy that. But I just think, I kind of like to make the whole room kind of resonate, and just kind of like vibrate and like, just kind of like almost like a alternative reality, really, right? Like a alien atmosphere or something. I remember going into the Atonal Festival a few years ago, and I can't remember who the artist was. It was just basically a drone, and that whole like Kraftwerk Berlin was just resonating and just like, it was amazing, man. It was one of the things I'll never forget. And all it was like a tone. I don't know. I try to do that. I try to create this like kind of like alternate reality where you can just kind of escape for a minute if you let yourself.
Well, so you moved out of the city, right? You're living by a lake.
Yeah, I'm about 40 minutes north of Detroit now. Like I'm living on Lake Huron. It's slow. It's quiet. It's like living in the countryside. Like if I was to move outside of Berlin, but I have the lake, so that's nice. But I'm still close enough where I can hop in the car and be in the middle of Detroit in less than an hour.
But peace is more a part of your life, your everyday life.
I would say so. You're right, it is. I just I'm really grounded, like with the water. Like I have to be able to see the water outside of my home.
I wanted to talk a little bit about your photography as well, because you were trained as a photographer?
Yeah, I went to art school. I went to art school in Detroit. To be honest, I never really finished. Got an apartment and wanted to work. But I spent a couple of years pursuing it. And I still love photography. Photography is, I would say, a big inspiration for my music.
I was going to ask because some covers of your records are, I think, photos that you've taken, right?
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
They are. Soma really likes the photography.
Okay.
They like the continuing, theme where from record to record, it's like kind of the same font and a different photo. So, I send them a file of photos and they can kind of find what they like. But, but the photos are actually like, I've always done one or the other. Like when I need a break from music, go grab a camera and go take some photos, and my photos are a big influence for my music too.
Well, it makes sense with your production process using field recordings. It seems really analogous to that, like capturing a moment.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Yeah, the photography is big. Design is big. I think I'm influenced by a lot of things other than music. I like architecture, just design in general. I mean, I can be inspired to make a song by looking at a building that I like. I don't really keep up with the latest music because I'm not a DJ, period. I was going to say not really, but really not at all. I'm not a DJ. I mean, I say that because, like I have done some mixes and on occasion I'm asked to do like a podcast or whatever, and I'll do them, but that's almost just an excuse to play songs I like for people. I'm not really a great DJ. I mean, I can do a DJ mix from Ableton or whatever. I kind of think of DJing in like 80s and 90s and early 2000s, and I thought, you can't DJ unless you know how to mix vinyl. And it's really funny though, because back then a lot of guys, in Detroit told me, well, you can't use a computer to play a DJ set. I mean, everybody that told me that in the 90s and early 2000s are using computers to do DJ sets right now. Mm. So I don't really know. I guess it doesn't really matter. Isn't it really about the playlist?
Yeah, maybe, I think being a DJ is about being a curator more than anything. Like, I think you could even be a sloppy mixer, but as long as the songs you select are cool.
Listen, I've heard some amazing DJ sets come out of a laptop, and I've heard some horrible DJ sets come from two turntables. Yeah. So, I mean, at the end of the day, isn't it more about what comes out of the speakers, right?
Yeah.
Than, how it's made.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Who are some of your favorite photographers?
I mean, I like a lot of fashion photographers, to be honest with you. I mean, obviously, like the older, like Helmut Newtons and newer guys like, there's like a lot of them that are working for magazines today. One thing I like about fashion photography is I'm not really like somebody who follows fashion at all. But the thing I always liked about fashion photography is the job of the fashion photographer is to create an alternate reality. So much photography out there is just documentation, photojournalism, where they have to go and get images of a specific thing, even like product photography. But, fashion photographer, goes out and tries to create like some really bizarre alternate reality. Just something like, if you look, most of the photography I see that's really stunning is fashion photography.
Interesting.
But it seems to offer the most leeway in terms of, what and how you photograph what you're photographing.
So in that sense, is that what's inspiring for your music then? Maybe to see an image and to be so taken by this other world that
I think
you feel that you also want to try to accomplish that in a different medium?
I do think so. Yeah. I think that you could do that with music. Maybe music needs to be less literal. So many of these genres have such a rigid template. It's a weird catch-22 because if you go outside of that template, people that normally like that kind of music don't like it. So then you feel almost like you have to be smacked back into line and create and follow the template.
Yeah.
Isn't that weird? I mean, unless you just say the hell with it, I don't care what anybody thinks.
Well, I think that is, when you think about anyone who's innovated, they have just done something like John Cage.
Oh, yeah.
He was on some TV show, I think, and they had asked him to perform a piece, and I forget the name of it now, but it was like he had to do stuff in like a bathtub and with a squeaky toy, and he was being completely serious about his craft, but people were laughing at him. And I know you sent along Philip Glass and Steve Reich's piece, Music for 18 Musicians, as an example of a piece that was really influential for you because you couldn't tell if it was acoustic or electronic.
Right.
And I would definitely put him in the camp of somebody who's like not towing the line.
Yeah, but I mean, like Philip Glass, for example, like, I don't know, that guy was like driving a taxi cab in New York until he was like in his 50s.
Really?
The guy went to like music school. He went to, I don't know, I think he went to Juilliard, and he got out and didn't think he had enough musical knowledge and went to India or somewhere, and amazing, and I mean, but he was doing his own thing, and people weren't buying it. So I mean, maybe there's some lesson there. I don't know. If you don't conform to some extent, people won't support you. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
If you go out too far, from the template, then people, But one thing about Music for 18 Musicians, I just love that piece because of that fact that you can't tell that it's acoustic or electronic.
Mm-hmm.
this has always been a real fascinating thing for me. Robert Rich, that new age musician, he had an interview in a keyboard magazine like 30 years ago. And I remember reading about this, and he was talking about creating glurpy sounds, Glurpy, glurpy. And that was the term that he used for creating sounds within this like weird zone where you can't tell if they're electronic, you can't tell if they're acoustic. He just defined it as like a glurp. This was one thing, like, sometimes you remember like something from an interview from like 30 years ago. Anyway, I always remember that like glurp zone that we talked about, and I like that too. Yeah. I like to do that. I like to use a lot of organic sounds. And
if you had to name your sound, well, I guess you have named your sound.
I don't know. People say, they ask me questions about dub techno, and I say, why are you asking me all these questions about dub techno? Well, that's what you do. And I didn't really know that, I got kind of like teamed up with guys like in the past that like Mike Schomer and I would say Steve Hitchell were much bigger dub heads than I am. Guys that I worked with in the past. See, they like dub music. I like the dub process, most of all. Like I like using a mixing board as a instrument. And I like my delays and I like my reverbs and things like that. But to me, like when I say dub, I always thought of dub as a process, not really like a particular type of music. I don't know. Dub uses like, the studio is basically a musical instrument. And that's something that I've always done, and something that I've really like got a lot of inspiration from dub music, doing that. But I find that music to be really a big inspiration. Like the do-it-yourself aesthetic in that music is remarkable. And I think the dub guys, I think we have a lot of music today that we would not have if it wasn't for those guys. Like those guys put the producer as the musician. I mean, I think would we have, the rap and the hip hop and stuff like that we have today without dub? I don't know. This was like, the first time guys that weren't musicians were sitting behind a mixer and making a record. That's what a lot of people are doing today. So it is a particular genre of music. But to me, when I reference dub, I reference, the process more than the actual music.
Interesting.
So
yeah, you sent this Burial Untrue.
Untrue, but that was like, I think the most like innovative album in the last 20 years. How I discovered that album is I was in Hard Wax this one evening. I think Torsten and I were going to dinner that night, and he asked me if I heard it. And I said, no, I haven't heard it. I heard the first one. Anyways, he recommended it. And, he wanted to know what I thought of it, like, a week later or whatever. And, man, I don't know. That record just really floored me. It didn't follow any of these templates I was talking about. It was just, weird collage of samples, and everything on there was kind of recycled from somewhere else. It was really a paradigm shift for me. Everything that was coming out at the time was, like using 909 sequencing, and it was just like, what is this? It was just a complete mishmash of samples, recycled material, repurposed pop songs and R&B songs. And you know what? I still don't know exactly how that album was even made, really, to be honest. But I try to accomplish something similar, but like in the techno domain, without the obvious like Burial like references like the skittery beats or the vocal samples, but like kind of like we were talking about dub and dub technique. Like I think his technique is fascinating. I'm really influenced by that, but I like things that come along every now and again and are like really like revolutionary, like the process of the way they did it, like, and Burial was definitely that. I don't think there's a single synthesizer on that record. It's just like all sampled riffs and, stuff lifted from other songs and repurposed. It's fascinating.
Feel inside, and it's on
So you're in Berlin for another couple of days.
Just a couple more
days.
You
used to live here. How does it feel to be back, and how does it compare
feels good, really.
to being by the lakeside in Detroit?
Yeah, that's interesting. I kind of miss the lake. Like the first few days here, I was just like, I don't want to be anywhere else. That's how it is. You go somewhere new and it's really exciting for a few days. And I took the trains around and went to the old places I used to live, went to my old apartments and looked at them and did this and that. And I still love it here. It's one of my 3 top favorite cities. I like Amsterdam. I just really like the vibe over there. And there's a certain comfort level there that I like. And I like Barcelona, which is really strange. I have to say, the first time I went to Barcelona, I really didn't like it. And then it really, really grew on me. I don't know how that happened, but it really grew on me.
It's a fun city. It has a light vibe. And I actually think of it as being kind of like diametrically opposed to Detroit in a lot of ways.
There's a real certain sophistication level in Barcelona, like with the arts and appreciation for the arts. I find it a lot here too in Berlin. I really do. But there's something about it. Like I said, Barcelona is a city that it took me like a little while to grow on me. And that's probably where I've been more than anywhere in Europe. I've been there close to 40 times over 15 years. Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Berlin. I mean, those are my 3 favorite cities. But, I kind of like my little country vibe.
Yeah, you said you have a good community in Detroit as well.
See, I think that's what's lacking in Detroit.
Oh, okay.
Home always feels comfortable because it's home. I was born at Hutzel Hospital in Detroit, and I lived in, Detroit, throughout my teenage years, and then moved out a little bit. But I've never been more than like 45 minutes or so from Detroit. The thing that is lacking in Detroit, I think, is the community. It's amazing here in Berlin. Like you can go sit at some cafe and run into 3 people, that make music and sit there and have a great conversation about it. And that's what makes me want to come to Berlin. Like it's like this like family. It's like a network. Detroit's an interesting city. From like 30 years ago, and Detroit today is not even the same city. When I was in high school and in Detroit, in the 80s, it was just really a completely different place. If you lived in Detroit 20 or 30 years ago and left and just came back today, you would be in a complete state of shock for like 15 minutes. Detroit was really dirty and really run down. I mean, it was more abandoned skyscrapers than anywhere else in the world. It was just a really, really strange place to be. But yeah, I've said, and I've talked to people before about this. I don't think we would have techno today if Detroit was like it is today back then.
Sure.
I think this grungy rundown. Well, I mean, Berlin kind of had a similar path, right? I mean, since the time the wall came down, and now Berlin in the last 10 years is just amazing. They're knocking all these old buildings down and building new, flashy buildings, and that's why Detroit's kind of like a sister, I think, to Berlin.
Yeah, definitely.
We had that kind of like rebirth, and Detroit back then, 80s, 90s was dirt cheap. I mean, you can get, just like Berlin, back then you could find an incredible, flat for 400 or 500 euros back then, I mean, those are 3,000 euros today, right? But Detroit's the same way. I can remember people living in downtown Detroit for $300 a month for enormous lofts, because nobody wanted to live down there. Well, again, now that's like Berlin too. Those $300 apartments are completely redone, and now they're $3,500 a month. That's a whole nother subject. Gentrification. Yeah. And, where do these people go? The artists and
out to the lakes.
Out to the lake. That's right. 45 minutes out of town.
Well, what else do you have coming up and on the horizon for you?
Well, I'm constantly recording. I kind of record at like a steady pace.
You're incredibly prolific. It's actually mind-boggling looking at your Discogs.
Hey, I always say some people go fishing and some people make music, right? I don't know. It's just my hobby. It's what I do. When I have a day off, and I have some free time, I, make a big coffee and go in my studio. And I just kind of tend to trickle out the tracks at like a pretty consistent pace. And then at some point, a label will say, we want to do another album or whatever. And then I just go back and I take an inventory of what I've done over the past year or two. And, I might have, who knows, maybe 90 tracks, and kind of like pick the ones I like the best. And, I'm constantly recording. I've got like 20 hard drives at home full of audio.
Wow.
And I just constantly, that's what I do when I'm bored. That's what I do when I'm, have a day off, or whatever, free time. At some point, they just always seem to kind of filter out, I'm talking to a couple labels, but we'll see. I've been kind of, like I said, playing with a little bit more harder and faster material, and
yeah, that's cool.
We'll see where that goes to. I'd like to do something faster than the Captagon.
Wow, that was already pretty fast.
That was pretty fast, but you know what? You can always go faster. So.
Before we started this interview, you said you'd want to be asked about something that you do outside of making music. Do you have any other hobbies outside of photography? Is there something you're really looking forward to doing once you're back home?
When I come over here to do a handful of shows, it takes honestly about 3 months prep. But that's not doing it like every day, working on it full time. But I enjoy doing live sets because I always come up with a lot of new tracks in the process of putting together a live set.
Totally, yeah.
Because I try to like make several dozen tracks to use as segues, new things. So honestly, it's about 2 or 3 months prep to come over here and do a handful of shows. And that's just, preparing segues, preparing new material for the live set, and that's what I've been doing for the last 3 months. So, I kind of would like to get home and like actually like enjoy summer, ride my bike and have some bonfires and spend some time at the lake instead of like spending every minute, like, in the studio getting ready to go to do a bunch of live sets,
Yeah,
so
I feel you.
that's the plan when I get back is to enjoy summer for the last couple months.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Chloe. It was a pleasure. I'm glad that the stars aligned and this was able to happen.
You know the moon, you know the stars, and you know the Milky Way.
Thank you for listening to another installment of Tresor Expansions. In this episode, you heard Rave New World by X101, a project from Jeff Mills, Mike Banks, and Robert Hood, Hide by Clock DVA, Quadrant Dub 1 by Basic Channel, Microgravity by Biosphere, Riga by Rod Modell, Untrue by Burial, and Music for 18 Musicians by Steve Reich. If you liked what you heard, please check out all the previous interviews in this series with Silent Servant and Helena Hoff. You can find them on the Refuge Worldwide website, as well as by searching for Tresor Expansions on YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen to audio. We'll be back again in 2 months. I'll see you next time.